Welcome to this talk on the laws from the Torah that were adopted into U.S. law. My name is Stephen Tick, and I've been researching, writing about, and lecturing on this subject for more than 20 years. I first became interested in this subject when I was sitting on the board of the Denver chapter of the American Jewish Committee. One day, the executive director received a call from the adjutant general of one of the military bases near Denver, asking if AJC knew of a Jewish lawyer who would be willing to sit on a panel with two Christian lawyers and talk to the troops about the laws from the Hebrew and Christian Bibles that were adopted into U.S. law. The director and the president of AJC thought of me, as I was an attorney and had been studying Torah for many years with the great Rabbi Zwerin of Denver. I agreed to do it. Over the next few weeks, I reread the Torah with that purpose in mind and was blown away at what I found. Then I reread it again, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So many of our laws came from the Torah. I wrote my speech, gave it to the troops, who responded beautifully. And for more than 20 years, I have been researching, writing about, and giving this talk. It is and has been a labor of love for me. The best place to start is with the Declaration of Independence. It says two incredible things. The first, you all know, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice that the famous sentence says, among these. In other words, according to the Declaration of Independence, our unalienable rights go beyond what was meant by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The second incredible thing is what follows in the very next sentence. I wonder how many of you remember what that sentence says. It says, and I quote, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted. In other words, according to the Declaration of Independence, the very purpose of government in general, and the government that our founders were trying to establish, is to secure our unalienable rights from the Creator. What were those rights that our founders thought were so compelling? And was the vision of our founders ever realized? Let's take a fresh look using the Torah as a guide. Before I begin, you should know that I'm not the first or the only person to have undertaken this analysis. From the earliest law codes adopted in the colonies, which were in 1645, almost 400 years ago, our history has been to use the Torah as a guide. How do we know that? Because the earliest law codes contained references or citations to the Bible, virtually all to the Hebrew Bible. Now, let's begin. The first right to be adopted into U.S. law is the right of people like you and me to live free from violence. Murder was prohibited, one of the 10 Commandments, as was kidnapping, rape, and other forms of violent crime. After all, in a good society, people need to be able to live free from violence. And those rights, human rights if you will, were accorded. Today, with threats of terrorism, mass shootings, and other violent crime, we are reminded almost daily that these rights are just as important to us as they were to the ancient Israelites. The next right to be adopted into U.S. law is the right to liberty. Think about that for a minute. Some 3,000 years before America was a glint in anybody's eye, the Torah records that God promised the ancient Israelites that they would be liberated people living upright in their own land with the same rights as our founders sought for us. And most of us thought that the Enlightenment thinkers or our founders thought that up. No greater proof of the biblical origins of our liberty exists than the very foundation documents of the Republic. As we have already seen, the Declaration of Independence says that we are endowed by the Creator with the unalienable right to liberty. Moreover, in the famous preamble to the Constitution, the one that begins, "We the people of the United States," it says that one of the purposes of the Constitution is to, quote, "secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity," close quote. Putting aside what the Constitution meant by ourselves and our posterity, which to a certain extent is an oy vey, as it wasn't inclusive, note that nowhere in the Constitution, or for that matter the Torah, does it grant us or guarantee us freedom, only liberty. As a matter of fact, until the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, the only place the Constitution even used the word free was an embarrassing place, to distinguish between free people and slaves for purposes of apportioning taxes and representation. The so-called 3/5 compromise that treated each slave as 3/5 of a person and was repealed by the 14th Amendment, one of the Civil War amendments. It was not until the Bill of Rights was adopted, and more specifically the First Amendment, did the Constitution protect certain aspects of freedom, first and foremost, freedom of religion. The reason that the Constitution and the Torah used the word liberty to describe our status was to make it clear that we as a people are and have been liberated from the tyranny of those that oppressed us. But we are not free in the sense that we can do whatever we want. No such right exists anywhere on earth. Rather, just as the liberty granted to the ancient Israelites was subject to the laws contained in the Torah, the liberty granted to us here in the U.S. was and is subject to the laws that the governments can and have lawfully adopted. And if you think 613 laws is a lot, 613 being the number of laws in the Torah, in the United States, the various levels of government have adopted so many laws that they can not only fill an entire library, but it takes a 3-year Juris Doctor's degree just to survey the law and get a more detailed peek at one or two areas of the law. The next right to be adopted into U.S. law is the right to justice. Perhaps no subject was more important in the Hebrew Bible than this subject, as the society God wanted them to establish was to be a just one. Not surprisingly, in the famous preamble to the Constitution, it says that one of the purposes of the Constitution is to establish justice. To ensure that their society was just, the Israelites were told that justice had to be blind and equal for all. Think of the depiction of a blind lady justice holding the scales of justice. The rich as well as the poor, the homeborn as well as the stranger. This principle, equal justice under law, is a fundamental principle of U.S. law and found its way into the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, one of the civil rights amendments. As a result, every one of us has, or is supposed to have, the exact same rights. Next, in order to make sure that nobody thought they were somehow exempt from or above the law, the Torah mandated, as does U.S. law, that no one is above the law, including kings and by extension, other governmental officials. Think about how brilliant that was. Some 3,000 years before America was a thought in anyone's mind, the Israelites were told that God's law and the rights they accorded them were superior to the dictates of kings, that they were to be a people governed by laws and not the whim of kings. That is exactly why the authors of the Declaration of Independence wrote what they did. They got it. Our rights are unalienable. They can't be abrogated by a king or anyone else. And if a king or any other ruler or governmental official does not respect our rights, we have the right to overthrow that ruler, or in modern parlance, impeach that official, as nobody is above the law. Next, the Israelites were told that to ensure that their society was just, they needed to establish a court system, appoint judges, hold trials, hear witnesses, and allow witnesses to be confronted to determine if they were telling the truth, which is the very foundation of our judicial system. Next, in order to ensure that the truth was known, perjury was prohibited, another one of the 10 Commandments. With every new political scandal in Washington and every news story that is sensationalized by the media, we learn over and over again the exact same lesson, that justice cannot be properly administered unless the truth is known. Hence, it was and remains a great sin to perjure oneself and cause an unjust result to exist. So much so that the penalty for perjury was the famous eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle that you've heard of. In other words, whatever the perjurer schemed to do to the other. Next, the Israelites were told that they had to honor and respect the decision of the courts. In other words, the Torah prohibited contempt of court, as does U.S. law. Next, the Israelites were told that ignorance of the law was no excuse, which was also adopted into U.S. law, as was the concept when somebody is old enough to be held accountable for their actions. In the U.S. today, the age at which youth are treated as adults ranges from 15 years old and up. And believe it or not, the Supreme Court has upheld life sentences for 15-year-olds. Next, the ancient Israelites were told to stay far away from a false charge. In other words, they were told that they must conduct themselves in such a manner as to avoid even the appearance of doing wrong. That is the exact same ethical standard that is applicable to every judge and used to be lawyer in this country. Under the rules of professional responsibility applicable to judges and under the Torah to the rest of us, judges, and under the Torah we, are not allowed to engage in any activity that appears to be improper. For if they do, they bring into question the integrity of the judicial system, and if we do, we bring into question who we are and our whole way of life. It's about security and trust and faith in each other and the system. And once you lose it, people become cynical and think that it's every person for themselves. And as I think we all instinctively know by now, that just doesn't work. It also brings into question the ability of the Israelites to fulfill their historic mission. God wanted the Israelites to be seen by other nations as a wise and discerning people, to be the example for others to follow. How could they accomplish that if they acted otherwise? Finally, the Israelites were told what qualities to look for in appointing judges. According to the Torah, the Israelites were told to appoint people that are wise, full of knowledge, and that hate ill-gotten gain. Keep that word hate in mind, as we will revisit it in another context a little bit later. However, for our present purposes, just remember that God wanted the Israelites to appoint judges, that if anyone had received ill-gotten gain, they would not want to appear in front of that judge. The next right to be adopted into U.S. law is the right of people like you and me to own real and personal property and to leave that property to our children upon our death, or the whole concept of private property. And the right to own and possess property was so important that it was protected from every kind of taking, including by theft, another one of the 10 Commandments, or by government taking, something liberally permitted under U.S. law if accompanied by compensation. After all, in a good society, people not only need to be secure in their persons, but in their possessions. Moreover, under the Torah, if someone lost or misplaced property, that person was entitled to get it back. In other words, there was no finders, keepers, losers, weepers. And guess what? Despite the fact that we all know that saying so well, that isn't the law here either. If you find something of value that doesn't belong to you, you are required to notify the police. And if nobody claims it, then and only then are you entitled to keep it. As an interesting little aside, when the children of Israel entered the Promised Land, the Torah records that God told them to divide the land amongst themselves, all of them. Note that the Torah did not say to give the land to the state and for the Israelites to operate in some form of collective. Nor did it say to give the land to a class of nobility or other elites, and that the Israelites should be serfs or peasants or slaves to them, conditions that existed in this country until the middle of the 19th century, and, if the truth was known, beyond. No, according to the Torah, God said to give the land to the people like you and me, all of us, the greatest land distribution ever known to humanity. The key, of course, to owning real and personal property is security. I cannot emphasize that point enough. It was all about security. The people could build and own their own homes, plant and harvest their own crops, raise their own livestock, plant and harvest their own vineyards and orchards, and sell the excess or whatever products they made, including wine, so that they could buy whatever goods came down the road by caravan, their trucks of the day, or into the port by ship. I wish we had time to discourse on the history of home ownership in the world. I think you would find that the Torah's prescription goes far beyond anything we have experienced. Even here in America, the Census Bureau estimates that only about 64% of us own our own homes, which does provide some security and is the major source of wealth to most Americans. However, about 2/3 of us that own our homes have mortgages on them that have to be serviced with income from a job or some other source. That leaves over 120 million Americans, including 60% of all Black American households, that live in rented apartments or homes, which provide little, if any, security. Lest you doubt that, get this. According to the Census Bureau, during the 23-year period that ended just before the COVID pandemic, residential rents in the United States went up approximately 300%. In other words, that statistic does not even include the meteoric rise in rents since the onset of the pandemic. Great for landlords, not so good for tenants. Can you imagine if your mortgage payment tripled by the 23rd year? It's unthinkable. Would never work. Moreover, in fast-growing cities like Denver, gentrification is pushing out minority populations that have traditionally lived in rented apartments or homes near downtown, and has severely damaged the institutions that historically served those populations, like the Urban League, Black-owned businesses, and historic Black churches. And finally, note this. In a 2019 study by the Federal Reserve Bank, 1 year before the COVID pandemic, 38% of all adults in the U.S. indicated that they could not pay their bills if faced with a $400 emergency expense. Think about that for a second. 38% of all adults in the U.S. don't even have $400 set aside for an emergency. There's a far cry from the security contemplated in the Torah, and we need to work on that if we want to even come close to building the type of society contemplated in the Torah. By the way, even though the Israelites owned their own farms or the means of survival, that did not mean that they were all guaranteed to succeed. Guess what? They weren't, just like here. And the Torah contemplates that some of them will fail and need help, a subject which we will get to shortly. The next right to be adopted into U.S. law is the right on the part of people like you and me to engage in commerce. Capitalism was permitted, except for certain limitations imposed on their ability to go into the banking and real estate industries. Individuals were free to build businesses, and like today, business centered around agriculture, food and ag are still 8% of GDP, the creation and marketing of various different products, and trade. The only real difference is the nature of the products and their means of conveyance. Yesterday, we made tangible property, like a pot or a tool, and conveyed the whole of an item, including title to it. Today, we not only make tangible property, but intangible property, such as intellectual property, and we convey less than the whole, such as by licenses to use apps and programs, which more and more have to be renewed each year. It's called recurring income. It's a favorite investing theme on Wall Street these days. Although there were various laws that impacted commerce, there was one overriding law which was expressed in various different ways, and that was honesty. Every aspect of people's dealings had to be honest, for, according to the Torah, everyone who deals dishonestly was said to be abhorrent to God. Under Roman law, which was widely adopted in the West, including for a time here in the United States, the concept of caveat emptor, or let the buyer beware, was the law. Under the Torah, the law is seller beware, or if the buyer speaks, the buyer as well, as everyone has an obligation to be honest. Today, U.S. law is consistent with biblical law. In the main body of law governing commercial transactions, the Uniform Commercial Code, it provides that every contract or duty governed by the code imposes an obligation of good faith in its performance and enforcement. The code defines good faith to mean honesty in fact. Moreover, in the main law in the United States governing consumer transactions, the Federal Trade Commission Act, the law prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices. An act is considered deceptive if it misleads or is likely to mislead the consumer. By the way, under the Torah, the requirement not to deceive each other was not just applicable to commercial relationships. It was also applicable to our personal relationships as well. Husband and wives, parents and children, and other family members and friends. For being dishonest in any of those relationships was just as abhorrent to God. We're supposed to love each other and not deceive each other, and deceit kills love. Just ask anyone with a deceitful spouse or other family member or friend. The next law to be adopted into U.S. law is the income tax law, which also found its way into the U.S. Constitution. Yep, you can blame God for that one. As you might expect, just like here, the tax law was complicated, especially if you factor in all of the involuntary contributions that a landowner or a relative had to make to the welfare of society at large and to the family in particular. To begin with, God opted for a flat tax. The rate was 10%, and it was applied against a farmer's yield, which was the major wealth of the day. However, that wasn't the end of it. A farmer couldn't harvest crops in the corners of the farmer's field, as those belonged to the poor and needy, who had a right to go on the land and get it. Moreover, a farmer could not go over the harvest more than once. Anything left over after the first harvest also belonged to the poor and needy, who had the right to go onto the land and get it. And there were more obligations. But the point that was made clear to the ancient Israelites is that it was responsibility of everyone that had means to take care of the poor and needy. Moreover, if a relative was in trouble and needed help, the other relatives had a legal obligation to help the relative in trouble if they had the means to do so. Almost as if they had the same joint and several liability that partners have today in a true partnership. If a relative lost land to foreclosure, then the closest relative with means had to redeem the land for the relative that lost it. If a relative had to go work for someone else as an indentured servant to pay off debts, then the closest relative with means had to pay off the debts for the relative that had become an indentured servant. In other words, the standard was self-sufficiency. It wasn't good enough just to give a relative some food, think of food stamps, or shelter, think of public housing. No, they had to return them to a level of self-sufficiency. Today in America, as a result of the disintegration of the family, the burden has shifted to the government, which has had to step up in ways that have gone way beyond what was contemplated in the Torah. Have we gone far enough to promote families and to support the poor and needy? I'll leave those questions to you. Finally, and for what it's worth, note that the Torah did not tax wages, although wages were contemplated in the Torah. I suspect that wage earners back then were the landless, or those that were not considered self-sufficient at the time. But it is interesting that the Torah exempted them from taxes. Moreover, it appears as if the Torah did not tax capital gains, although those too were contemplated in the Torah. The next right to be adopted into U.S. law was the right to choose our own leaders. I realize that this subject is not well defined in the Torah. However, in Deuteronomy, Moses is recorded as having told the people 2 times to choose their own leaders and their own magistrates and officials. The people liked that idea and responded by saying, "What you propose to do is good." Later in Deuteronomy, Moses tells the people that if they want a king like the other nations about them, think secular federal government, as the original government contemplated by the Torah was more akin to a loose confederation of independent tribal states with a centralized religious authority. They could have one, but one, it was up to them. In other words, the people had to consent. 2, the king would be subject to the law and not above it, which, as we know, was adopted into U.S. law and is the heart of the official oath of office. 3, the king had to be one of them and not a foreigner. Think Article 2 of the Constitution, requiring the president to be a natural-born citizen. 4, the king could not use the position to amass wealth. Think the Emoluments Clause contained in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. And last, the king could not act haughtily towards the people. I'm not exactly sure what haughtily meant. If it meant that the king had to respect the rights given to the people, well then, we know that was adopted into U.S. law. And to make sure that was clear, we adopted the Bill of Rights and made it applicable to the entire federal government. Later on, the Supreme Court made it applicable to the states as well. If it meant that the king could not exceed the authority allocated to the king, then time and again in the United States, the Supreme Court has overturned executive action on the grounds that the president exceeded the president's authority. In fact, in the U.S. today, presidential candidates often campaign on the promise that if elected, they will take executive action on day 1 of their term, much of which ends up in the courts. As the subject was not well developed in the Torah, I will not address it further, other than to reiterate that it was a major beginning. The next right to be adopted into U.S. law is the right to restitution, or to be made whole if somebody injures you or damages your property. Known in the U.S. as the tort laws or the negligence laws, they are the laws that require each of us to take personal responsibility for our own negligence or wrongful actions and to make restitution for the wrong or damage that we have caused. After all, in a good society, people need to take personal responsibility for their actions and make things right if they hurt someone or damage their property. An easy example would be a car accident. The person at fault cannot simply get out of his or her car and go up to the person who was hit and say, "I'm sorry, I did not mean it," and then walk away. In a good society, if someone negligently or otherwise hurts someone or damages their property, the person at fault has to make the other person whole, including hospital bills and lost income, if that is relevant. And in every state today, the right to even drive a car or truck or to engage in other activities is conditioned upon the driver and the owner having insurance so that the driver or owner will have the ability to make restitution. There were many other rights and laws that were adopted into U.S. law, but I fear if I continue to discourse on them like I have so far, I'll begin to bore you. So please, just let me list a few of my favorites and then conclude. First up is the law prohibiting bribery of government officials, judges, and others, because, according to the Torah, bribes blind the eye of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. And that was not going to be tolerated in the just society that the Torah commanded us to create. Do you think unlimited corporate or individual campaign contributions constitute bribes within the meaning of that law? Do you think they blind the eye of the discerning? I'll leave those questions to you. Next up is the draft. Yep, you can blame God for that one too. In the Torah, the draft age was 20, and there were exemptions for personal reasons. During the Vietnam days, the draft age was 18, and there were also personal exemptions. As you all know, today we have an all-volunteer army, but the government does retain the right to reinstitute the draft. Next, the beginnings of the debtor and creditor laws, including the statute of limitations on debt, the law exempting certain property from the claims of creditors, something greatly expanded under U.S. law to allow a fresh start under the bankruptcy laws. The law prohibiting creditors from entering our homes to collect the debt or seize collateral, and the laws allowing real property to be redeemed if foreclosed upon. We might as well add usury to this list. No interest was permitted on loans between Israelites. Next is the beginning of the labor laws, including the right to decent working conditions, the right to time off, including on the Sabbath, another one of the 10 Commandments, and on national holidays, all of which applied to workers, and the right to be paid timely for wages earned. Next is the right to live in a society free from slander and by extension libel. However, the U.S. has carved out exceptions to that rule, which frankly speaking have not served us well. Next is the basic criminal laws, the right to defend your home or the Make My Day law, the health laws that, get this, required people with certain communicable diseases to be quarantined until they are better and no longer contagious. Needless to say, by virtue of COVID-19, I think we all know by now that the law is the same here in the United States. Next is the laws protecting the handicapped from harassment. And the last one I will give you is the beginnings of the conservation and environmental laws, which should not come as a surprise to anyone, as the Torah states that the reason for our existence was to tend to God's creation. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Was the vision of our founders realized? Have we succeeded in forming a government that has protected the unalienable rights granted to us? To a substantial extent, the answer to that question is yes, we have. Now, please allow me to conclude with a few of the laws from the Torah that were not adopted into U.S. law, but nevertheless form the foundation of our culture. First up is love your neighbor as yourself, the famous pronouncement of the golden rule found in Leviticus. Note that neighbor includes strangers. I wish I had time to tell you the story of how 3 rabbis answered the question, what does the golden rule have to teach us about how we are to feel about ourselves? Love your neighbor as yourself. If interested, I posted it on my website, TorahAndUSLaw.com. Next is the obligation to rise up before the aged and show deference to the old. Now that I'm almost 70, I'm beginning to see the wisdom in that rule. Next, do not hate another in your heart. In fact, hate is a bad word. Get rid of it, unless, of course, you are choosing judges. Never forget what President Nixon said just before he left the White House in disgrace. He was giving a speech to his staff and tried to explain what went wrong. He talked about all the hate shown his way and all of the opposition he faced. He summed up his failure this way: people may hate you, but they cannot win unless you hate them back, because then you destroy yourself. The next one fits nicely with the prohibition of hating another in your heart. Do not bear a grudge or seek vengeance. And the last one that I will give you, which is perhaps the most important, is this: do not stand idly by. Every one of us is responsible to address the problems we see in society. Every one of us. And we cannot stand idly by and pretend that somebody else will do our share. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. If any of you would like a copy of this speech, complete with footnotes containing citations to the Torah and U.S. law, feel free to download it from my website, torahanduslaw.com. In addition, if anybody would like me to give this talk at their house of worship or to another group, I would be honored. Simply leave me a message on my website and I'll get back to you. Thank you and goodbye.